50 gay closet cases in golden age of Hollywood that will shock you. What if everything you thought you knew about Hollywood's golden age was a lie? The perfect husbands, the dreamboat boyfriends, the all-American heroes. Many of them were hiding a truth that could have destroyed their careers overnight. Behind the tuxedos and studio smiles were secret lovers, fake marriages, and lives lived in constant fear of exposure. Tonight, we're ripping open the studio closet and asking the question the PR teams never wanted you to ask: who was really living a double life? Before we dive in, hit subscribe, tap like, and let's expose the legend. This is Legends of Black Excellence. Richard Pryor. Hollywood's golden age looked flawless from the outside: tuxedos, ball gowns, and impossibly glamorous romances. But the studio machine was built on secrets. Behind closed doors, dozens of actors lived double lives as classic closet cases, forced to hide who they really were to keep their names glowing on the marquee. Handsome leading men were paired with carefully chosen starlets. Marriages were arranged, and entire biographies were polished until they shone. For some, like silent-era star William Haynes, honesty meant exile from the screen. For others, like Rock Hudson and Montgomery Clift, it meant a lifetime of anxiety, staged publicity dates, and the constant fear that one careless photograph or overheard conversation could end everything overnight. Many of these 50 gay closet cases spent their lives walking a tightrope between fame and truth. Raymond Burr invented a tragic story about a deceased wife and child that suddenly sit up Richard Pryor. Known as a raw, fearless comedian who tore into race power and hypocrisy, Pryor also joked in his routines and writings about romantic encounters that didn't fit the narrow macho mold audiences expected. He spoke with a disarming honesty that blurred the lines people tried to draw around masculinity and desire. After his death, his widow Jennifer Lee claimed he'd had a relationship with Marlon Brando, while one of his daughters publicly rejected that story, highlighting how sensitive and contested these personal histories can be. Taken together, these roughly 50 stories, from polished film idols to TV fathers, from horror icons to rock gods and revolutionary comics, reveal a system that punished authenticity and rewarded silence. Some figures eventually came out when the culture softened and the risk was no longer total career destruction. Others died with their truths only half revealed in memoirs, letters, and the memories of friends. The real shock behind 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood isn't just how many stars were queer or questioning. It's how hard the industry worked to keep them invisible, and how much courage it took for any of them, including someone as outspoken as Richard Pryor, to push even a little bit against the closet door. Ramon Novarro. On the surface, Ramon Novarro was everything Hollywood wanted in a leading man: dark-eyed, chiseled, and impossibly romantic. Born in Mexico in 1899, he rose from bit parts to international fame with Ben-Hur 1925, becoming one of the first Latin heartthrobs to conquer the silent screen. Studios sold him as the exotic, devoutly Catholic gentleman every woman dreamed of. Magazine spreads showed him at home, respectable and wholesome, reinforcing a carefully constructed image. What audiences never saw was the fear behind that smile, a man who knew that if his attraction to men ever became public knowledge, his career, his finances, and even his safety could vanish overnight. Off-camera, Novarro's life was shaped by an impossible triangle: his faith, his sexuality, and the brutal moral code of the studio era. Raised in a conservative religious environment, he internalized shame so deeply that intimate relationships were often brief, hidden, and haunted by guilt. Alcohol became one of his ways to cope. Unlike some contemporaries who entered arranged marriages to quiet suspicions, Novarro never took a wife, which only made studio handlers double down on public relations control. Fan magazines hinted coyly at his loner nature, while the real reason remained locked behind closed doors and whispered only in small, trusted circles. By the 1950s and 60s, the fame that had once protected him no longer mattered. Roles became fewer, money grew tight, and the safety net of the studio system dissolved. As with many gay men of his generation, casual encounters sometimes overlapped with economic vulnerability and risk. In 1968, Navarro invited two young men to his home. They expected to find a large stash of money that simply didn't exist. The night ended in a savage beating, and his death at age 69 officially recorded as asphyxiation due to bleeding and injuries. The trial that followed sensationalized the salacious details while barely touching the deeper tragedy, a man who had spent a lifetime hiding only to be destroyed in his own living room. Within the broader frame of 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood, Navarro's story stands as one of the most haunting. He wasn't merely a closeted star. He was a symbol of how racism, homophobia, religion, and the ruthless machinery of early Hollywood could intersect in a single life. His murder is shocking, but the deeper shock is how predictable his vulnerability was in a world that denied him the right to live honestly. Behind every radiant close-up of Ramon Navarro is the outline of a man who paid for his beauty and talent with secrecy, loneliness, and ultimately his life a reminder that the golden glow of old Hollywood was often cast over very dark rooms. Cary Grant. Cary Grant was the man Hollywood built as the ultimate straight dream, tall, witty, devastatingly charming, and always getting the girl by the final reel. Under the studio lights, he was the perfect advertisement for heterosexual romance, from The Awful Truth to North by Northwest. But when people talk about 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood, that will shock you. His name is almost always near the top of the list, not because there's a signed confession, but because his private life never quite matched the press releases. Born Archibald Leach in Bristol, England, he spent a lifetime crafting Cary Grant as a role, not just a name. Years later, he would famously quip, "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant." "Even I want to be Cary Grant," a line that hints at how carefully that persona was built, and how separate it might have been from the real man. The most persistent rumors circle around his relationship with fellow actor Randolph Scott. The two met on the set of Hot Saturday in 1932 and soon moved into a shared beach house in California, which the press nicknamed Bachelor Hall. Publicity photos showed them cooking together in aprons, lounging on the patio, and relaxing in a way that looked far more like a couple than just roommates. Studios tried to soften the impression by planting stories about glamorous starlets visiting the house, but the images of domestic comfort between the two men never really went away. For over a decade, they lived together on and off, while fan magazines described them as Hollywood's most eligible bachelors. Were they simply close friends or something more? No one ever stated it plainly, but the speculation became an inseparable part of Grant's legend. At the same time, the studios needed Cary Grant to fit neatly into a straight romantic mold. He married 5 times, each union heavily covered by the press as further proof that their leading man was exactly what audiences imagined. Later in life, when questioned about the rumors, Grant brushed them off, once saying he had nothing against gays but wasn't one himself. His daughter has alternated between firmly dismissing and cautiously acknowledging the possibility that he might have had relationships with men earlier in his life. For fans trying to read between the lines, the contradictions only deepen the mystery. Was he protecting a fragile career, shielding his privacy, or simply tired of being cross-examined about his most intimate choices? Within the wider story of 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood that will shock you, Cary Grant sits at a fascinating crossroads. He's less a clear-cut case than a mirror, reflecting how much pressure the system put on its stars to look a certain way, love a certain way, live a certain way. His life shows how studio contracts, fan expectations, and tabloid culture could blur the line between rumor and reality, until even the person at the center of it all joked he wanted to be Cary Grant too. Whether you see him as a closeted icon, a victim of endless gossip, or something in between, one thing is undeniable: the gap between the charming man on screen and the complicated human being off screen is exactly what still shocks and fascinates audiences today. Randolph Scott. Randolph Scott was built as the rugged backbone of Hollywood's golden age, the tall, stoic cowboy riding into Technicolor sunsets, always the hero, always the man's man. In film after film, he embodied straight traditional masculinity so perfectly that audiences rarely questioned the image. But when people talk about 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood that will shock you, Scott's name keeps surfacing not because there's a signed confession hidden in an archive, but because his private life has never quite lined up with his public persona. Behind the scenes, carefully managed publicity and a very unusual living arrangement quietly fueled one of Hollywood's most enduring rumors. That rumor begins with Cary Grant. The two actors met in the early 1930s and soon moved into a shared Los Angeles home that fan magazines dubbed Bachelor Hall. Studio photographers were invited in, and the resulting photos showed something striking: Randolph Scott and Cary Grant cooking side by side in the kitchen, relaxing by the pool, reading on the patio domestic images that looked a lot like married life just without a wife in sight. Publicists tried to balance this by linking each man to various actresses, but those cozy, almost intimate images of the two bachelors stuck in the public imagination. For more than a decade, they lived together on and off, and Hollywood gossip never stopped whispering. Was this just companionship in an expensive city, or a love story the era would not allow to be named? To protect careers, the industry leaned hard on traditional optics. Scott eventually married Patricia Stillman, and the couple adopted 2 children, settling into the image of a respectable, conservative Hollywood family. Grant, meanwhile, cycled through a series of high-profile marriages. Officially, both men denied being anything other than friends, and there is no definitive document proving a romantic relationship between them. Biographers, however, have spent decades poring over letters, photographs, timelines, and interviews, some suggesting there was more than friendship, others urging caution. What we know for sure is limited. What people believe often depends on how they read the silences. Within the larger story of 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood that will shock you, Randolph Scott represents something especially intriguing. Not a clear-cut outing, but a symbol of how much had to be hidden, or at least never said aloud, for a leading man to stay bankable. His legend sits at the crossroads of fact speculation and studio myth-making. Whether he was a gay man in the closet, a bisexual man caught between worlds, or a straight actor misunderstood by history, the tension between his rough, hyper-masculine screen image and his complicated real life is exactly what continues to shock and fascinate modern audiences long after the final Western fade-out. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was the perfect illusion of the golden age leading man, tall, broad-shouldered, impossibly handsome, and always falling in love with the right woman by the end of the movie. In romantic comedies like Pillow Talk and dramas like Giant, he was sold as the ultimate fantasy for female audiences. Yet when people talk about 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood, that will shock you. His story is often the one that hits hardest, because it shows how far the system would go to protect an image and how much a single man paid for that protection. Off-screen, Rock Hudson was living a completely different reality. In the strict studio era, being known as gay could mean instant career death, broken contracts, and public disgrace. Agents and executives knew this, so they acted like crisis managers and image police. Hudson's private life had to be carefully contained. Friends were filtered outings, monitored rumors aggressively shut down. When whispers started spreading too loudly, the studio helped arrange a short-lived marriage to his secretary, Phyllis Gates, in 1955. To the public, it looked like a fairy tale, the world's most desirable bachelor finally settling down. Inside Hollywood, many already knew this was more about optics than romance. Hudson played along because in that era, there really wasn't another option if he wanted to keep working. Talk show appearances, fan magazine spreads, and red carpet photos all reinforced the narrative of the charming straight heartthrob. Meanwhile, in more private circles, he tried to carve out some space to be himself, carefully, cautiously, always aware that one wrong move could blow everything apart. The pressure of living in two worlds at once, idol on screen, hidden self off screen, was a constant, silent weight that never made it into the scripts. Everything changed in the 1980s. When Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS, it was at a time when the disease was heavily stigmatized and widely misunderstood. In 1985, he publicly confirmed his illness, becoming the first major Hollywood star to do so. Overnight, the glamorous facade of the classic leading man collided with a brutal modern reality. His announcement shook the world. The ultimate straight symbol of the 1950s was revealed as a closeted gay man facing a deadly virus most people barely understood. Rock Hudson's legacy within 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood. That Will Shock You is not just about secrets. It's about how his final act of honesty helped change public awareness and forced the world to confront both AIDS and the human cost of the Hollywood closet. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was never the polished, invincible hero that Golden Age Hollywood usually liked to sell. On screen, he brought something raw, fragile, and deeply human to films like A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, and The Misfits. He was one of the first true method actors in American cinema, all nervous energy and wounded gaze, the opposite of the easy, confident charm of someone like Cary Grant. That vulnerability captivated audiences, but it also mirrored a real inner struggle. When people talk about 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood that will shock you, Clift is a central, heartbreaking figure, a man whose genius and pain were tightly bound to the fact that he could never safely live openly. In private, Clift was attracted to men, something well known among close friends and co-workers, but never spoken aloud in public. Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s was merciless toward anyone who didn't fit the straight, wholesome image demanded by the studios and the censors. For a leading man, being outed could mean the end of everything. So Clift moved through a world of hidden encounters, trusted confidants, and coded conversations. Elizabeth Taylor, who became one of his closest friends and fiercest protectors, understood both his brilliance and his torment. Their bond, tender, loyal, and intensely emotional, became one of the most famous friendships in film history, a private safe harbor in an industry that always felt like it was watching. Then came the car accident in 1956, after leaving a dinner party at Taylor's house. The crash left his face damaged, his body in constant pain, and his already fragile psyche even more unstable. The beautiful, sensitive young man audiences had fallen in love with now had to face the camera, altered, haunted, and exhausted. Painkillers, alcohol, and self-destruction began to dominate his life. The studios still wanted Montgomery Clift star, but the real Clift was slipping further away, lost in a mix of physical agony, emotional turmoil, and the crushing weight of a secret he could never put down. Within the larger idea of 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood, that will shock you. Montgomery Clift isn't just another rumored name, he's almost the tragic archetype. His story shows what happens when extraordinary sensitivity, queer desire, and an unforgiving system collide. He died in 1966 at just 45 years old, his career, body, and heart worn out long before their time. When you look back at those performances now, the trembling hands, the pained eyes, the sense of someone constantly bracing for impact, they feel less like acting and more like a man quietly telling the truth in the only place he was allowed, in front of a camera behind a mask the world thought was just a role. Anthony Perkins. Anthony Perkins is forever etched into film history as Norman Bates, the shy, haunted motel owner from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a character so unsettling that it almost swallowed the actor who played him. To audiences of the time, Perkins looked like the perfect, sensitive leading man, tall, boyish, soft-spoken, and clearly meant to be paired with the right girl on screen. But when you look at him through the lens of 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood that will shock you, his story becomes less about a single horror role and more about the quiet dread of living a life that couldn't be spoken aloud. The tension you see in his performances didn't come from nowhere. It grew in a world where discovery could mean the end of everything. In his early years, Perkins moved in circles where attraction between men was an open secret, but never a public fact. He was romantically linked to fellow actor Tab Hunter, another handsome leading man being carefully packaged as straight for the mid-century audience. Their relationship had to exist in the margins, private homes, coded phone calls, carefully chosen friends. No studio press release would ever mention it, and no fan magazine would ever print their names side by side unless it was about a movie. Hollywood needed Perkins to be a bankable heartthrob, not another problem for nervous executives to manage. So, like so many on the list of closeted stars, he learned how to walk that invisible line, real feelings in the dark, smiling denial in the spotlight. In 1973, Perkins married photographer and actress Barry Berenson, and the two had 2 sons together. On the surface, it looked exactly like the kind of domestic stability the industry loved to see the odd, intense actor from Psycho transformed into a family man. But marriage didn't magically rewrite his past or his orientation. It simply added another layer to the balancing act. Friends and biographers have described a man split between a genuine love for his wife and children and a lifetime of same-gender attraction that could never be fully owned in public. The marriage gave him cover, but it didn't erase the years he had already spent hiding. The most devastating chapter of his story came in the 1980s, when Perkins contracted HIV during the height of the AIDS crisis. True to the habits the closet had taught him, he kept his diagnosis secret from the public, fearing stigma and career fallout, even as the roles slowed and the disease advanced. He died in 1992 from AIDS-related pneumonia, leaving behind a body of work that still unsettles and fascinates film lovers. Within 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood, that will shock you. Anthony Perkins stands as a haunting example of how horror didn't just happen on screen. For him, the real terror was a lifetime of being watched by cameras while never feeling safe enough to be fully seen. Raymond Burr. In the glossy world of mid-century television, Raymond Burr looked like the last person you'd ever expect to be hiding anything. As the unflappable defense attorney in Perry Mason and the tough wheelchair-bound detective in Ironside, he became one of the most trusted faces in American living rooms. Viewers saw him as the very picture of upright traditional masculinity, calm, authoritative, almost fatherly. The audience believed they knew him, but the man behind the camera was living a far more complicated and carefully guarded life. To protect his privacy, Burr built one of the most elaborate cover stories in Hollywood. He didn't just dodge personal questions. He invented an entire tragic past. In interviews, he spoke tearfully of a wife who had died of cancer and a young son lost in a plane crash. These details were repeated for years, painting him as a solemn widower who had buried himself in work to escape his grief. Only after his death did biographers discover there were no records, no obituaries, no documents to support these stories. The dead wife and child weren't a misunderstanding, they were armor. A grieving family man was the perfect disguise in an era that would never have accepted a gay television hero. Behind that carefully constructed myth, Burr shared his real life with Robert Benavides. The two men lived together for decades, described publicly as companions or business partners, while privately building a home, a vineyard, and a quiet, enduring partnership. Friends understood the reality. The public saw only the sanitized version filtered through euphemisms and coded language. It was a love story that had to be hidden in plain sight, nestled between production credits and press releases. Raymond Burr's story shows how far a star had to go to reconcile fame with truth. He wasn't the flashy playboy the tabloids usually chased. He was a steady, reassuring TV presence whose entire career depended on the trust of a conservative audience. To keep that trust, he created ghosts, a wife, a child, a heartbreak that never actually happened. The real Burr, the man who loved and lived alongside one partner for most of his life, stayed in the shadows. The most shocking thing isn't that he was gay. It's the sheer effort, discipline, and storytelling required just to protect a simple, ordinary love from a world determined not to see it. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy was the kind of actor audiences trusted instantly. With his worn, intelligent face and quiet intensity in films like Judgment at Nuremberg and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, he seemed like the embodiment of decency and straight-talking integrity. Off-screen, the official narrative matched the image: a devoted Catholic, a married man, a serious craftsman who lived for his work. But behind that polished story was a far more tangled reality, one that has led many biographers and historians to place his name among the closet cases of old Hollywood, or at least among those whose desires did not fit cleanly into the era's rigid norms. The first crack in the simple story is his marriage. Tracy wed Louise Treadwell in 1923, and they had 2 children, but they lived apart for most of their adult lives. His Catholic faith made divorce unthinkable to him, so he remained married on paper while building another life in Hollywood. Enter Katharine Hepburn. Their relationship became one of the most famous partnerships in film history. 9 movies together, decades of companionship, and a love story that the public accepted without question. Yet even that relationship, as described by some who knew them, didn't always fit the tidy romantic template. At times, it looked as much like 2 fiercely bonded, complicated people clinging to each other in a world where neither could fully be what they wanted. Then there are the rumors, never confirmed, but never entirely dismissed, that Tracy may have had romantic or emotional entanglements with men. Some biographers and Hollywood insiders have pointed to his deep discomfort with his own desires, suggesting he struggled not only with alcoholism and depression, but also with feelings he could not reconcile with his faith, his marriage, or his public image. Unlike some contemporaries whose same-gender relationships are well documented, Tracy left behind little hard proof. What we have are patterns, whispers, and the testimony of those who observed his torment up close. It would be irresponsible to state speculation as fact, but equally naive to ignore how persistent these questions have been. Spencer Tracy's life, viewed through a modern lens, feels like a study in conflict, faith versus reality, public virtue versus private chaos, the need to belong versus the fear of being truly seen. He drank heavily, disappeared on binges, and carried a weight that seemed to carve itself into his performances. Whether he was gay, bisexual, or simply a man crushed under impossible expectations, his story fits the tragic shape of many closeted or questioning figures of his era. The shock isn't just the possibility that one of Hollywood's most respected leading men might have been hiding a forbidden part of himself. It's how clearly his work hints at a soul in turmoil, and how carefully the system around him made sure that turmoil never had words. James Dean. James Dean is forever frozen in time, cigarette in hand, collar-up eyes full of trouble. With Rebel Without a Cause. East of Eden and Giant, he became the face of teenage angst and lonely rebellion in the 1950s. Hollywood sold him as the misunderstood straight heartthrob, the brooding outsider every girl wanted to fix. But when people dig into the list of closeted and quietly queer figures from that era, his name always comes up. Not because he ever gave a neat label to himself, he didn't, but because his life and words never fit into the narrow box the studios built around him. Behind the iconic still photos was a much more fluid and complicated man. Dean formed intense attachments to both men and women, and his closest friend writer William Bast later described a romantic relationship between them that went far beyond simple friendship. There were also stories of Dean's fascination with older, powerful men, including persistent rumors about a charged, unstable dynamic with Marlon Brando. Some accounts paint Dean as almost obsessed with Brando, chasing him emotionally, while Brando kept him at arm's length. Whether every detail is true or not, a picture emerges of a young star whose desires didn't respect the neat lines of 1950s morality or studio marketing. At the same time, the public-facing James Dean dated women in ways that were often as much performance as passion. His relationships with actresses like Pier Angeli and later Ursula Andress became part of the official narrative, the sensitive young rebel who still paired off with glamorous starlets. Behind the scenes, though, friends talked about how Dean resisted being pinned down. His most famous quote on the topic is chillingly honest: "I'm not going to go through life with one hand tied behind my back." It's a line that sounds casual at first, but in context, it feels like a quiet refusal to limit himself to desire to gender roles to anyone's rules but his own. Dean died at just 24 in a car crash, leaving behind 3 major films, a handful of interviews, and a stack of unfinished questions. Because his life ended so abruptly, there was never a long middle age where he tried to explain or rewrite his past. That vacuum invites speculation, but it also preserves something raw and unresolved about him. When people today look at the hidden queer history of old Hollywood, James Dean stands out not as a neatly labeled case, but as a symbol of how complicated and untidy real attraction can be, especially in a world determined to pretend everything is simple. His legend is shocking, not just because he might have loved men as well as women, but because in his short time on Earth, he seemed to be reaching for a freedom the industry around him simply wasn't ready to allow. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando didn't just act in front of the camera, he detonated on it. From A Streetcar Named Desire to On the Waterfront and The Godfather, he redefined what screen acting could be: raw, unpredictable, emotionally dangerous. To the public, he was the ultimate hyper-masculine rebel, a brooding force of nature that women desired and men envied. But the man behind that myth was far more complicated than the posters suggested. When people look back at the hidden queer history of Hollywood, Brando stands out not as a coy rumor, but as someone who openly admitted his experiences in a way that was shocking for his time. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Brando occasionally dropped the mask. In later interviews, he said plainly that like many men, he had been involved with men as well as women, and that he felt no shame about it. That one statement sliced straight through decades of coded gossip. It didn't rebrand him as a gay icon, but it did shatter the idea that the most iconic tough guy in American cinema fit neatly inside a traditional box. Here was the legendary Stanley Kowalski, the very image of brute heterosexual power, casually acknowledging a private life that refused to obey Hollywood's rules. Around that admission swirl, the stories rumored relationships or encounters with men, whispers about emotional entanglements with younger actors, and most famously the claims that he and comedian Richard Pryor were once involved. After Pryor's death, his widow said it had happened. One of his daughters angrily denied it. There is no definitive proof that settles the argument, and a responsible telling has to admit that. What's not in dispute, though, is that Brando lived in a way that disregarded polite categories. He loved intensely, burned through marriages, and seemed to care very little about what anyone thought he should be. What makes Marlon Brando so startling in the context of closeted Hollywood is that he never played the role of the frightened, carefully managed star. He was chaotic, political, sometimes self-destructive, but also oddly honest about his contradictions. The studios might have tried to market him as a dangerous ladies' man, yet he kept hinting that the danger came from a much deeper refusal to conform to acting traditions, to fame, to straightness as an unbreakable rule. Decades later, his work still feels electric, but so does his refusal to pretend that desire is simple. In a world built on denial, Brando didn't fling the closet door wide open, but he did leave it unmistakably ajar. Tab Hunter. Tab Hunter looked like he'd been designed in a studio lab to be the perfect 1950s heartthrob. Blonde hair, Beach Boy smile, square jaw, easy charm on movie posters and fan magazines. He was America's golden boy, the clean-cut dream boy next door. In films like Damn Yankees and Battle Cry, he played straight-arrow soldiers and wholesome romantic leads, the safe alternative to edgier rebels like James Dean. Teenage girls screamed his name. The studio printed carefully staged photos of him dancing with pretty starlets, and the marketing machine pushed one simple message: this is the ideal all-American straight guy. Behind that image, the reality was much more fragile. Tab Hunter was a gay man trying to survive in the most unforgiving era imaginable. Being exposed could have meant instant career destruction, public scandal, even criminal charges in some places. He had to navigate his feelings in secret, constantly aware that one wrong person, one police raid, or one tabloid leak could end everything he'd worked for. At one point in the early 1950s, he was actually arrested at a private party that police raided, and though the studio tried to bury the story, the fear it left behind never fully went away. From that moment, he understood just how dangerous it was to be himself. Meanwhile, the studio leaned harder into the illusion. Publicists arranged dates with women like Natalie Wood to quiet rumors and give the fan magazine something reassuring to print. On red carpets and at publicity events, Tab smiled on cue, posed with carefully chosen female co-stars, and played his part in the ongoing performance. Away from the flashbulbs, though, he built a real emotional life with men, including a relationship with Anthony Perkins. That romance, however genuine, had to exist in shadows, no hand-holding in public, no dinner dates where the cameras could find them. It was love with conditions, always looking over your shoulder. Years later, long after the golden age had faded and the stakes had shifted, Tab Hunter did something that would have been unthinkable at the height of his fame. He told the truth in his own words. His memoir and the documentary that followed revealed not a scandalous double life, but a gentle, decent man who had been forced to choose between honesty and survival. The most shocking part of his story isn't that the 1950s golden boy was gay. It's how convincingly the system made the world believe otherwise, and how much quiet courage it took for him decades later to finally say, "This is who I've always been," and ask the world to see the boy behind the poster. William Haynes. William Haynes was one of Hollywood's first big casualties of the closet, only unlike many others he refused to step inside it. In the 1920s, he was a genuine superstar at MGM, a top-billed leading man in silent comedies and early talkies like Tell It to the Marines and Show People. Studios marketed him as playful, charming, and irresistibly boyish, a natural fit for the new era of screen idols. But behind the publicity stills and fan magazine fluff, Haynes was living a reality that made him a quiet revolutionary. He was openly gay among friends, and he wasn't interested in pretending otherwise just to protect his career. While other actors hid behind studio-arranged dates or rushed marriages, Haynes built a real life with the man he loved, Jimmy Shields. They lived together as a couple at a time when simply being discovered in the wrong bar could land you in jail or on the front page in disgrace. Everyone in Hollywood's inner circle knew what they were to each other. The difference was that Haynes didn't seem ashamed of it. He showed up with Shields at parties, brought him into his social world, and treated him as a partner rather than a secret. That quiet defiance made him both admired and dangerous in the eyes of powerful men who needed their stars to look safe to middle America. Eventually, the studio laid down an ultimatum. Haynes, they said, could keep his contract and leading man status if he ended his relationship with Shields and entered into a fake marriage with a woman for show. For most actors of that era, the choice wouldn't even have been recognized as a choice. Career came first, and love, if it survived at all, lived in shadows. Haynes did something almost unheard of. He said no. He chose Jimmy over MGM. The studio fired him, blacklisted him, and quietly moved on to more manageable faces. What could have been the end of his story turned into a remarkable second act. Cut off from acting, Haynes reinvented himself as an interior designer and quickly became one of Hollywood's most sought-after tastemakers, decorating homes for stars and moguls, including executives from the very studio that had cast him aside. He and Shields stayed together for nearly 50 years, until Haynes' death. In a list of 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood that will shock you, William Haynes stands out not as the man who hid the best, but as the one who refused to hide at all and paid the price, then built a new life anyway. Cesar Romero. Cesar Romero glided through Hollywood with a kind of effortless elegance that made him hard to forget. Tall, impeccably dressed, charming, and always just a little bit amused, he lit up the screen in films like The Thin Man Ocean's 11, and countless studio pictures where he played suave Latin lovers, aristocrats, and rogues. Later, a whole new generation met him as the cackling, candy-colored Joker in the 1960s Batman TV series. To audiences, he looked like the ultimate bachelor, sophisticated, flirtatious, and inexplicably single. To anyone tracing the hidden queer history of old Hollywood, though his name almost automatically joins the list of closeted men who learned to survive by letting questions hang in the air unanswered. One thing about Romero always stood out: he never married. In an era when studios practically pushed leading men down the aisle to avoid speculation, he stayed officially unattached from start to finish. Fan magazines tried to spin this as charmingly mysterious he was too devoted to his career or simply hadn't found the right girl yet. Meanwhile, in industry circles, it was an open secret that Romero preferred male company. He was frequently seen at parties and events with stylish, attractive men on his arm, and he never seemed particularly eager to play the fake romance game with starlets for the cameras. He didn't stand at a podium and announce anything. He just quietly declined to live the way the script said he should. What makes his story so intriguing is that he managed this balancing act without the spectacular scandals that derailed other careers. Romero wasn't arrested in police raids, caught in tabloid exposes, or forced into emergency marriages to correct his image. Instead, he cultivated a persona that was already a little theatrical, a little larger than life. That slight exaggeration, especially later as the Joker with that painted grin and manic energy, became a kind of protective disguise. If he seemed flamboyant on screen and charmingly private off it, people could sense something was different without pushing too hard for an explanation. The studios got a reliable, bankable performer. He got just enough space to be himself among those who mattered. Cesar Romero's life adds a fascinating layer to the idea of gay closet cases in Hollywood's golden age, because it isn't only about fear and tragedy, it's also about finesse. He didn't storm the gates of the system or martyr himself for honesty. Instead, he slipped through its cracks with a smile, refusing to provide the neat traditional narrative everyone expected. He built a long, steady career, kept his dignity, and shared his real life only with those he trusted. The shock looking back isn't just that the Joker was likely a gay man in an unforgiving era. It's how gracefully he managed to turn a rigid, suspicious industry into a stage where he could perform and still quietly reserve his truest self for the people who knew him beyond the makeup and the lights. Richard Chamberlain. In the 1960s, Richard Chamberlain was television's first true swoon-worthy doctor. The impossibly handsome star of Dr. Kildare with soft eyes, perfect hair, and a bedside manner that made millions of viewers fall a little bit in love. Fan magazines crowned him the ultimate wholesome heartthrob. Studio publicity framed him as the ideal future husband. To middle America, he was the picture of straight, respectable masculinity. But for anyone looking back at hidden LGBTQ lives in old Hollywood, his story sits firmly in that shocking list of gay men who were adored on screen while quietly erasing themselves off it. From very early on, Chamberlain knew he was attracted to men, and he also knew that Hollywood in the 1960s would never forgive him for saying so. The result was a life lived in careful layers. Publicly, he gave shy, charming interviews, sidestepped personal questions, and allowed studios and press agents to build him into a fantasy for female fans. Privately, he carried the constant fear that being honest would destroy everything: the series, the endorsements, the carefully cultivated fame. That anxiety only intensified when he took on high-profile roles in The Thornbirds and Shogun in the 1980s, becoming an international symbol of smoldering heterosexual romance, just as the AIDS crisis made homophobia even more vicious. Behind the posters and magazine covers, however, was something far more ordinary and far more real: a long-term partnership that quietly lasted decades. Chamberlain built a life with actor and producer Martin Rabbit, sharing home's work and daily routines like any married couple, but without the public's acknowledgement. Friends and insiders knew, but the wider audience got nothing more than vague references to companions and close friends. It was a split-existence domestic stability at home, a carefully edited version of himself everywhere else. The emotional toll of that divide, loving someone deeply while pretending to be permanently available in the public imagination, became one of the central wounds he would later describe. In 2003, at around 69 years old, Richard Chamberlain finally did what his younger self never dared. He came out publicly in his memoir, Shattered Love. The revelation stunned many fans who had grown up with his poster on their wall, but for him, it was less a bombshell than a release. He spoke candidly about the decades of fear, shame, and compartmentalization, and about the joy of finally living without a permanent mask. The twist is bittersweet by the time he felt safe enough to tell the truth. The years when the truth might have set him free as a young man were long gone. His story is shocking not because he was gay, but because a man so clearly built for romantic roles had to spend most of his prime pretending his real romance didn't exist. Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton didn't look or act like a typical Golden Age leading man. He was stout, intense, almost volcanic on screen, with a face that could shift from kindly to terrifying in a heartbeat. In films like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mutiny on the Bounty, and Witness for the Prosecution, he became the go-to actor for complex, tortured, larger-than-life characters. Audiences saw a master craftsman, a brilliant chameleon, and on paper, a happily married man. But behind that respectable facade, his private life was far less straightforward, and that's why his name so often appears on lists of hidden queer figures from Hollywood's most controlled era. Laughton married actress Elsa Lanchester in 1929, and at first glance they looked like a perfect bohemian couple, both eccentric, both gifted, both deeply embedded in the British theater world, and then the Hollywood studio system. They stayed married for decades, but by most credible accounts, their relationship functioned more as a creative partnership and loyal friendship than a conventional romance. Lanchester later wrote and spoke about the fact that they never had children, and hinted quite plainly that this had everything to do with Laughton's orientation. She didn't frame it with bitterness, but with a kind of matter-of-fact acceptance. This was who he was, and this was the deal they made. Within the industry, it was an open secret that Laughton was more interested in men than women. Stories circulated about affairs with younger actors, discreet encounters and crushes that could never be acknowledged in public. Unlike some contemporaries who tried to bury any hint of scandal in bravado, Laughton instead seemed to fold his private anguish into his work. There's a particular kind of woundedness and self-contempt that runs through many of his performances, as if he understood all too well what it meant to be judged for something you couldn't change and to fear exposure every single day. The pressure of living that way took a toll. Laughton struggled with his weight bouts of depression and the constant clash between his internal life and the rigid moral code of his time. He poured himself into acting and directing, channeling everything: frustration, longing, self-doubt into the characters he played and the stories he helped shape. When he died in 1962, much of the public still saw him simply as a great character actor with a quirky marriage. Only later, as memoirs and biographies appeared, did the fuller picture emerge: a gay man who found refuge in his art while being denied the possibility of living openly. That gap between his towering public talent and his constrained private reality is exactly what makes his story so haunting today. Robert Reed. Robert Reed looked like the safest man on television. As Mike Brady on The Brady Bunch, he was America's ideal dad, kind, patient, steady, the smiling anchor of a perfectly blended family. For millions of viewers in the late 1960s and early 70s, he wasn't just playing a father, he was the father figure they wished they had at home. Posters, promos, and interviews all reinforced one image: straight, wholesome, reliable. That made the truth behind the scenes all the more shocking. The man sold as the ultimate TV family man was a gay actor trapped in a time when being honest about that could have ended his career overnight. In his real life, Robert Reed knew from early on that his orientation and his profession were on a collision course. The industry he worked in was brutally unforgiving. One tabloid story or outing could have destroyed not just the Brady Bunch, but any chance of future work. So Reed made a choice that countless others on this closet cases list also made. He stayed silent. The cast and crew largely knew Florence Henderson, and several of the Brady kids later said they were aware, but it was a silence wrapped in respect and fear. No one asked, he didn't volunteer, and the unwritten rule was simple. If this comes out publicly, in the 1970s, everything burns. That double life came with a heavy cost. Reed was famously intense about scripts and often clashed with producer Sherwood Schwartz, partly because he wanted the show to be smarter and more realistic. But also, many believe, because he carried so much anger and frustration under the surface. Imagine spending years playing the picture-perfect husband to a woman on screen while knowing you can't introduce a real partner off-screen, can't speak openly, can't ever fully relax. The gap between Mike Brady and Robert Reed grew wider every season, and that emotional strain seeped into his private life in ways he rarely discussed. In 1992, Reed died at 59. The initial story was colon cancer, but when details of his death certificate emerged, the public learned he was also HIV positive, a fact he had kept as carefully guarded as his sexuality. Only then did many fans realize that the man who'd played the safest dad on television had been living on the sharpest edge of stigma for years. His co-stars later spoke with compassion about the burden he carried and how different his life might have been in another era. Robert Reed's place among the gay closet cases of Hollywood isn't about gossip. It's about a talented, thoughtful man forced to hide the most basic truths of who he was, all while playing the one character America trusted more than almost anyone, the perfect father. Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power was the kind of star Hollywood liked to carve into marble. With sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, and effortless charm, he lit up films like The Mark of Zorro, Blood and Sand, and Witness for the Prosecution. To audiences in the 1930s and 40s, he was the ultimate romantic hero, dashing, honorable, always getting the girl. Studios sold him as pure leading man perfection, and fan magazines backed it up with carefully posed photos, glowing profiles, and breathless coverage of his relationships with women. But as people have revisited the hidden history of that era, Tyrone Power's love life has started to look far more complicated than the perfect poster image. Behind the curated public narrative, there were persistent whispers that Power's attractions didn't stop at one gender. In Hollywood social circles, he was long rumored to have close, possibly romantic relationships with men as well as women, fellow actors, creatives, and powerful figures who understood the risks of being honest in that world. None of this could be acknowledged openly at the time. Even a hint in the wrong column could cause studios to panic. So the gossip stayed in coded remarks. Private letters and stories passed quietly from one insider to another. To the outside world, he remained the flawless matinee idol, while the more complex human version of Tyrone Power existed in the spaces where cameras and reporters were not allowed. The studio, of course, knew what it needed: a straight, stable image. Power married 3 times to actresses and socially acceptable partners, and had children, reinforcing the picture of a conventional family man. These marriages may well have contained genuine affection, but they also functioned as a powerful shield in an industry terrified of scandal. Publicity departments made sure there were plenty of smiling photos: Tyrone with his wife, Tyrone with his kids, Tyrone as the embodiment of respectable masculinity. Meanwhile, the rumors never entirely went away because the people who saw him off-set at parties on location in private sensed that the official story wasn't the whole story. Tyrone Power's life was cut short in 1958 when he suffered a heart attack at age 44 while filming Solomon and Sheba in Spain. The suddenness of his death froze his image in time, forever young, forever heroic, forever the dashing swordsman riding into a painted sunset. But for many who study old Hollywood's closeted history, his story feels more like a faded photograph with details missing. We may never know exactly where his desires began and ended, or how he understood himself in a world that gave him no safe language for it. What does remain is the sense of a man who did his job so well, the illusion stuck. and a lingering question about how different his life might have been if he'd been allowed to be more than just the perfect leading man. Freddie Mercury. Freddie Mercury didn't look like a man who hid. On stage with Queen, he was pure electricity, strutting in a tight white tank top, commanding stadiums with a flick of his wrist, turning songs like Bohemian Rhapsody, We Are the Champions, and Somebody to Love into anthems that felt bigger than life itself. To millions, he was the ultimate rock god, flamboyant, funny, untouchable. Yet when people talk about closeted and semi-closeted icons whose lives still shock us, his name always rises to the surface. The paradox is brutal. A man so fearless in his art was still pushed into silence about who he really was. From early on, those around him knew Mercury was attracted to men. His private world included long-term relationships, especially with Jim Hutton, who would stay by his side until the end. But in the 1970s and 80s, the idea of a globally famous rock frontman openly calling himself gay or bi was almost unimaginable. Press interviews were filled with coy jokes, evasive answers, and carefully vague comments. Fans could read between the lines if they wanted to, but there was never a straightforward declaration. His image became a kind of tightrope camp and theatrical enough to feel transgressive, but never framed in plain words the industry and tabloids could weaponize. That silence became even heavier when AIDS entered the story. As friends and fellow musicians began to fall ill, Mercury himself received a diagnosis in the late 1980s. Rather than turn his life into a public tragedy, he chose to guard his privacy with almost ferocious determination. He kept recording, kept performing when he could, and refused to let the press turn him into a spectacle. Only on November 23, 1991, did he finally issue a short statement confirming that he had AIDS. 24 hours later, he was gone. In that single day, the mask dropped, and the world had to confront the reality that one of its most beloved performers had been living and dying under the weight of prejudice and fear. What makes Freddie Mercury's story so powerful in any conversation about hidden queer lives and entertainment isn't just that he was a gay man who concealed parts of himself. It's that even inside the constraints of that closet, his art still tore through barriers. He turned vulnerability into something operatic, loneliness into something communal, and performance into a kind of coded confession. The real shock isn't that the front man of Queen loved men. It's that even someone as larger-than-life as Freddie Mercury felt it was safer to let his music speak the truth while his interviews looked the other way, and that for years the world gladly sang along without asking why those songs felt so painfully, beautifully real. George Takei. George Takei first stepped into history at the helm of the Starship Enterprise Not a Pride Parade. As Hikaru Sulu on the original Star Trek in the 1960s, he became one of the first Asian American actors with a major dignified role on American television. To viewers, he was a symbol of progress, calm, capable, and quietly heroic on the bridge. Off-screen, though, he was carrying a secret that could have shattered the fragile career he was building. For decades, George Takei was a closeted gay man in an industry and a country that had no interest in letting someone like him be fully seen. His fear was not imaginary. Hollywood at the time could barely handle interracial romance, let alone an openly gay actor of color. Takei knew that one careless admission could mean no more roles, no more auditions, and a lifetime of being whispered about instead of hired. So he did what so many others on that closet cases list did. He compartmentalized. Public interviews focused on Star Trek, on his family's history in U.S. internment camps during World War II, on his career. The part of him that loved men stayed deliberately off-camera, carefully shared only with people he could trust completely. The sci-fi universe he helped bring to life imagined a future of equality, but his own present was built on silence. What's striking about Takei's story is how long that silence lasted. Even after Star Trek ended and he became a beloved figure on the convention circuit, he still stayed officially closeted. Years rolled by, generations of fans grew up adoring Sulu, and yet the man behind the character continued to live in a kind of emotional lowlight, always aware that open honesty might undo everything he had built. It took a political spark heated debates over same-gender marriage in California for him to finally decide enough was enough. When George Takei publicly came out in the mid-2000s, he didn't just acknowledge who he was, he stepped straight into activism. He spoke openly about his longtime partner, now husband Brad, and used his growing platform, later supercharged by social media, to advocate for LGBTQ rights, racial justice, and remembrance of Japanese-American internment. The shock with Takei isn't a scandalous revelation, but the contrast. The same man who once had to hide in order to keep a job is now one of the loudest, funniest, and most visible queer voices in popular culture. His journey from silent star to outspoken icon shows exactly how much the world has changed and how long, for people like him, it refused to change at all. John Travolta. John Travolta burst into global fame like a disco comet white suit, blazing in Saturday Night Fever leather jacket and slick hair in Grease, the very definition of straight, youthful cool. For millions, he became the poster boy of 1970s heterosexual fantasy. Every dance move, every smirk, every on-screen romance, reinforcing that image. As his career evolved through urban cowboy pulp fiction, and beyond, the narrative stayed the same. Travolta, the charming leading man, devoted husband and family man. Yet for decades, his name has hovered in the background of conversations about closeted Hollywood figures, not as a proven fact, but as one of the most persistent what-ifs in modern celebrity culture. From early on, rumors about his private life followed him like a stubborn shadow. Whispers circulated about alleged relationships with men, sightings in certain spaces, and friendships that tabloids tried to turn into something more. None of this was ever publicly confirmed, and in many cases, the stories originated from anonymous sources, gossip columns, or people with financial motives. Travolta, for his part, has repeatedly denied being gay and has maintained that the speculation is either false, malicious, or a misunderstanding of his personal boundaries and friendships. The gap between his statements and the rumors has only fueled more fascination, turning his personal life into a kind of ongoing mystery the public feels oddly entitled to solve. Complicating everything further are the lawsuits that have popped up over the years in which some men have accused Travolta of inappropriate behavior. Many of these claims were withdrawn, dismissed, or quietly resolved, and no court has ever definitively proven wrongdoing. Still, each headline adds another layer to the perception that something about his private life doesn't match the spotless heterosexual image created in his early years. It's crucial to remember that accusation is not proof, and that celebrities, especially those with long careers, attract opportunists as well as truth-tellers. But the mere existence of these cases has kept the questions alive, especially in spaces obsessed with closet cases and hidden histories. At the same time, Travolta's visible life has followed a very different script. He was married to actress Kelly Preston for nearly 3 decades until her death in 2020, and they raised 3 children together. His public grief over the loss of his wife and son felt deeply genuine, cutting through the gossip with something raw and human. That's where the tension sits between a man who seems sincerely attached to his family and faith and a swirl of speculation that refuses to die. Whether he is a closeted figure, a straight man trapped in perpetual gossip, or something in between is ultimately known only to him. What's undeniable is that John Travolta's name now lives in that uneasy space where myth, rumor, and respect for privacy collide, and that in itself is part of what continues to shock and preoccupy curious audiences. Anderson Cooper. Anderson Cooper grew up inside the spotlight long before he ever stepped in front of a news camera. As the son of socialite and designer Gloria Vanderbilt, he was photographed at galas and written about in gossip columns while most kids were still figuring out homework. Later as a war correspondent, and then the silver-haired anchor of Anderson Cooper 360°, he built a reputation on toughness, empathy, and calm in the middle of chaos. Viewers saw him as a kind of modern Cronkite, serious, authoritative, and safely neutral. For years, that neutrality extended to his personal life. Questions about who he loved were met with polite deflection, and he was quietly added to the mental list of glass closet celebrities people everyone assumed were gay, but who never said it out loud. Behind the scenes, Cooper wasn't hiding from the people who mattered. Friends, family, and colleagues knew he was gay and had known for years. He attended events with partners, lived openly in his private circles, and never pretended to date women for the cameras. But as a journalist, he believed that talking about his orientation might distract from his work or undermine the perception of objectivity he'd fought hard to build. The cost of that choice crept up slowly as debates over LGBTQ rights grew louder. His continued silence began to feel, even to him, like it might suggest shame rather than privacy. He wasn't ashamed, but the public didn't know that. In 2012, he changed that with a single, carefully written email to writer Andrew Sullivan, giving permission for it to be published. In it, he stated plainly that he was gay, that he always had been, and that he was happy and proud of who he was. There was no glossy magazine cover, no dramatic press conference, just a few paragraphs that finally aligned the public story with the private one. Overnight, the "is he or isn't he?" conversation stopped being a game and became something more meaningful, one of the most recognizable news anchors in the world saying in effect, "Yes, it's true, and it's nothing to whisper about." Since then, Anderson Cooper has become a kind of quiet landmark for visibility. He continues to anchor breaking news, moderate debates, and interview world leaders, but now he does it as an openly gay man who also talks about fatherhood, family, and the long road it took to get there. He's not a golden age movie idol forced into sham marriages. He's the modern echo of all those closeted figures who never got to speak. The shock with Anderson Cooper isn't that he's gay. That was hardly a surprise. It's that it took so long for someone so honest in his reporting to feel safe being equally honest about himself, and how powerful that honesty became once he finally put it in his own words. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo built her legend on a single haunting sentence: "I want to be alone." On screen in Anna Karenina, Camille, and Queen Christina. She was tragic, majestic, and impossibly beautiful, a woman who seemed to belong to another world entirely. In the golden age of Hollywood, where studios pushed every star into neat romances and carefully staged photo spreads, Garbo was the grand exception. She refused premieres, dodged interviews, and sidestepped nearly every attempt to turn her private life into public spectacle. That self-imposed distance made her a mystery, and into that mystery, people have poured decades of speculation about who she really loved. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Garbo never played the role of the glamorous, boy-crazy starlet. She had relationships with men, including her famous entanglement with actor John Gilbert, but even those were wrapped in ambiguity. Rarely did she gush about anyone, and she seemed almost allergic to the idea of marriage. At the same time, she formed intense, emotionally charged bonds with women, most notably with writer and socialite Mercedes de Acosta. Surviving letters from Garbo to de Acosta are filled with tenderness and longing far beyond the tone of ordinary friendship. De Acosta later claimed they had a romantic relationship, while Garbo herself stayed silent, neither confirming nor publicly denying anything. That silence became part of the legend. Hollywood, of course, thrived on clarity: who's dating whom, who's engaged, who's off the market. Garbo gave it nothing. No staged engagement photos, no teary breakup interviews, no red carpet couple branding. She walked alone, lived quietly in New York after retiring, and let the studios stew in their frustration. For queer audiences and historians looking back, this refusal to play along feels deeply significant. In an era when gay and bisexual stars were pressured into sham marriages and fake romances, Garbo's stubborn privacy reads like a kind of resistance. She would not be their perfect straight fantasy, and she would not explain herself on demand. Was Greta Garbo gay, bisexual, or simply a fiercely private woman who loved to cross boundaries and refused to label herself? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain, and she clearly preferred it that way. What we can see is a pattern: intense relationships with women, a cool distance from heterosexual expectations, and a lifelong insistence on controlling her own story. That's why her name still appears whenever people talk about hidden queer lives in classic Hollywood. The shock with Garbo isn't some scandalous revelation. It's that one of cinema's greatest icons may have lived and loved in ways the world around her refused to understand, and she chose mystery over confession right up to the end. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was the scandal the golden age could never quite contain. On stage and screen, she was pure dynamite. Raspy voice, blazing eyes, one-liners sharp enough to cut glass. In films like Lifeboat and on Broadway long before that, she played women who were brash, sensual, and utterly unapologetic. What shocked Hollywood wasn't just her talent. It was how little interest she had in pretending to be respectable. While studios tried to package other stars as wholesome Tallulah set fire to the packaging and smoked a cigarette over the ashes. From early on, Bankhead made it clear that she was attracted to both men and women, and she did so with a wicked, almost reckless sense of humor. When asked about her love life, she didn't retreat into vague answers or fake romances. She leaned into the rumors. That famous quip, "I'm as pure as the driven slush," wasn't just a joke. It was a declaration she refused to be shamed for her desires. Stories about her affairs with actresses, singers, and chorus girls ran through theater gossip like electricity. Names like Marlene Dietrich and Billie Holiday are often mentioned in connection with her, sometimes backed by anecdotes, sometimes by whispers, but always with the sense that Tallulah crossed lines other people were too scared to approach. Unlike many closeted stars who married to satisfy public expectations, Tallulah treated marriage almost like another performance. She had one brief union with actor John Emery, but even then she didn't suddenly turn into a model housewife. Her real romance seemed to be with chaos itself: wild parties, outrageous comments, and a refusal to keep her relationships of any gender tidy or hidden. Studio publicists didn't quite know what to do with her. She wasn't interested in posing as the perfect straight star or pretending her private life matched what middle America wanted to see, in a town built on carefully curated illusions that made her both a liability and a legend. Tallulah Bankhead's place in Hollywood's hidden queer history is different from the quietly tortured closet cases. She wasn't the tragic figure hiding in fear. She was the loud, laughing, chain-smoking storm, blasting open doors other people kept locked. She still had to operate within a homophobic system. Roles dried up, reputations were weaponized, and she paid a price for being so brazen. But she also carved out a space where queerness wasn't whispered. It was shouted, teased, and toasted with another drink. The shock with Tallulah isn't that she loved women as well as men. It's that in an era of almost total silence, she dared to be noisy about it. Judy Garland. Judy Garland will always be Dorothy, standing in a blue gingham dress and singing "Over the Rainbow," but her real-life legacy reaches far beyond Oz. In the golden age of Hollywood, she was packaged as the vulnerable girl next door with the miracle voice, someone audiences were meant to protect, adore, and worry about. Off-camera, she was pushed to the breaking point by studios that controlled her body, her schedule, even her diet. Pills to stay awake, pills to sleep, brutal work hours from childhood onward. Judy didn't grow up in Hollywood. She was consumed by it. That pressure carved deep cracks into her life: addiction breakdowns, financial problems, and a constant tug-of-war between her talent and her pain. What turned Judy Garland into an enduring LGBTQ icon wasn't just her roles, but the way she seemed to carry the same bruises her queer fans did. Gay men in particular saw themselves in that combination of dazzling performance and private heartbreak. She sang about yearning, about somewhere over the rainbow, where life could be different at a time when being openly gay could cost you your family, your job, even your freedom. Her concerts became sanctuaries, where men who had to hide all week could finally cry, laugh, and cheer together under the cover of darkness and music. The phrase, "friend of Dorothy" slang for a gay man didn't emerge by accident. It reflected just how deeply she had become one of us in the hearts of people who were never allowed to be fully themselves. Her connections to queer life were also very literal. Many of the people closest to her musical arrangers, designers, accompanists, and friends were gay men living under constant threat from police raids, blackmail, and public humiliation. Judy's loyalty to them, her refusal to distance herself for respectability's sake, and her own outsider status in Hollywood cemented a bond that felt more like family than fandom. She wasn't a polished, unreachable goddess. She was messy, emotional, sometimes chaotic, and always honest about her struggles. That rawness made her feel real in a system built on lies, and queer audiences clung to that honesty like a lifeline. Even her death in 1969 has been woven into LGBTQ history. She died in London just days before the Stonewall Uprising in New York, and some have speculated that the grief over her passing helped fuel the anger that exploded into resistance. Whether or not that's literally true, the symbolism stuck Judy Garland as both the tragic end of one era and the emotional spark of another. Today, when people talk about closet cases and coded lives in classic Hollywood, Judy's story stands beside them in a different way. She wasn't a hidden queer star. She was the beacon shining out to those who were hiding the voice, promising that somewhere, somehow, there might be a place where they could finally step into the light. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier was the kind of actor people called the greatest of his generation, without irony. On stage and screen in Hamlet. Henry V, Rebecca Wuthering Heights, he seemed carved out of Shakespearean granite noble, commanding, intensely masculine in that old-school, clipped British way. Hollywood and the British theater world both treated him as the gold standard of serious, straight-leading man. Married 3 times, knighted, then made a lord, he was the very picture of establishment respectability. And yet, when you dig into the more hidden history of that era, his name keeps brushing up against quiet, persistent questions about who he might have loved when no one was looking. The most famous fault line in his polished life is his marriage to Vivien Leigh, the incandescent star of Gone with the Wind. On paper, they were a dream couple, 2 beautiful, gifted actors burning up stages and screens together. In reality, their relationship was stormy, marked by Leigh's mental health struggles, Olivier's affairs, and long stretches of emotional distance. He had other relationships with women as well, but some biographers and colleagues have hinted that women may not have been the whole story. Over the years, stories have surfaced suggesting close, possibly romantic connections with men, often focusing on his long, oddly intense friendship with comedian Danny Kaye, with whom he allegedly lived for a time while working in Hollywood. None of these claims were ever confirmed by Olivier himself, and hard proof is scarce. What we have are fragments, gossip from fellow actors, suggestive anecdotes, correspondence that feels more intimate than casual, and a pattern of defensiveness whenever certain topics came up. In a time when being labeled gay or bisexual could destroy a career, even one as towering as his silence was as much self-defense as it was privacy. If there were relationships with men, they had to exist in the margins, hotel rooms, on tour, private clubs, conversations coded so heavily that outsiders would dismiss them as just theater people being dramatic. That ambiguity is exactly why his name still appears in lists and discussions about closeted or quietly queer figures in classic cinema. Laurence Olivier is not a simple case of hidden gay icon or purely straight hero wronged by rumor. He sits in a murkier, more human space where desire, ego, fear, and social pressure all collide. The shock looking back isn't just the possibility that Britain's great Shakespearean lord may have loved men as well as women. It's the realization that even someone at the very top, knighted, revered, seemingly untouchable, still lived in a world where certain truths could never be spoken aloud, and where the greatest actor on stage might have been performing just as hard once he stepped off it. Mae West. Mae West walked into Hollywood like she owned the place and then behaved as if no one could convince her otherwise. Long before most actresses were even allowed to be overtly flirtatious on screen, she was tossing off lines like grenades in films such as "She Done Him Wrong" and "I'm No Angel." With her slow, smoky voice, hourglass figure, and lazy, knowing smile, she didn't play the nice girl studios preferred. She played women who knew what they wanted and weren't the slightest bit ashamed of it. In a town obsessed with controlling female sexuality, Mae West turned hers into a weapon, a joke, and a business empire all at once. What makes her especially fascinating in the context of queer history is that she didn't just tolerate LGBTQ people, she surrounded herself with them and put them in her shows. Before Hollywood, her stage work in New York already scandalized censors with plays about sex deviants and drag performers. She wrote roles that gave queer-coded characters wit, power, and presence, rather than treating them as punchlines. Offstage, she hired gay performers, befriended drag queens, and kept company with men whose sexuality the industry usually tried to erase. While other stars were being carefully shepherded away from anything that might look suspicious, Mae West walked straight toward it and invited it into the spotlight. Her attitude was as bold as her wardrobe. When critics or moralists accused her of corrupting public morals, she answered with jokes that turned the accusation back on them. She didn't apologize, didn't pretend to be more wholesome, and didn't distance herself from queer friends for the sake of her image. Instead, she quipped her way through censorship battles and shrugged off scandal as free advertising. Her famous line, "It's not the men in my life that count. It's the life in my men," wasn't just a punchline. It was a hint that she refused to let anyone define what desire, partnership, or respectability should look like. Mae West herself wasn't closeted. If anything, she was the opposite, a straight, or at least mostly straight woman who made room around her for people the world wanted hidden. That's why she often pops up alongside closeted stars when people talk about the secret queer history of Hollywood. While others were forced to lie about who they loved, she used her power to give them work protection and a little bit of reflected audacity. The shock with Mae West isn't that she shared their secret. It's that in an age of fear and silence, she stood there in sequins and feathers and essentially said, "They're with me, and if you don't like it, that's your problem, not ours." Vincent Price. Vincent Price looked like a man born to haunt the screen. With that tall frame, velvet voice, and sly, knowing gaze, he became the undisputed king of horror in films like House of Wax, The Fly, and the Edgar Allan Poe adaptations he made with Roger Corman. To audiences, he was the elegant villain, the cultured madman, the charming menace who could make a single raised eyebrow feel like a threat. Off-screen, the studios framed him as refined and respectable an art lover, a gourmand, a married gentleman with a taste for the good life. But as people have looked closer at the hidden lives of classic Hollywood, his name keeps surfacing in quiet conversations about queerness and the closet. Price's public life fit the expectations of his era on paper. He married 3 times, had a daughter, and played the role of witty, urbane husband at premieres and parties. Yet even in those years, there were hints that he didn't fit neatly into a single simple box. He moved easily in artistic theatrical circles where rigid rules about desire softened a little. Friends later described him as someone who was far more open-minded and personally more fluid than a 1950s or 60s fan magazine would ever dare to print. He loved opera, modern art, cooking, literature. His world was full of people who didn't conform, and he didn't seem interested in policing anyone's boundaries, including his own. After his death, the picture became clearer. His daughter Victoria has spoken about her father as someone who in private acknowledged attraction that wasn't limited strictly to women and was completely comfortable around queer friends and spaces. She has described him as a man who would almost certainly be called bisexual today, even if that word wasn't one he used publicly in his own lifetime. It doesn't mean his marriages were fake or loveless. It means his heart and interests were bigger than the era could comfortably accept in public. The horror star with a secret cliché doesn't really fit him. There's more warmth than scandal in the story. What stands out about Vincent Price isn't a dramatic outing or a tabloid downfall, but a quiet, cultivated complexity. While other actors of his generation were forced into stiff defensive denials, he seems to have lived with a gentle, wry understanding of who he was and who he loved, sharing that truth with those close to him, and letting the rest of the world see only what it was ready for: a sophisticated villain, a Renaissance man, and an artist whose real life, like his films, contained far more shades than anyone realized at the time. Liberace. Liberace didn't just walk on stage, he arrived. Rhinestone-encrusted capes, chandeliers on the piano candelabras glowing, and that signature grin beaming at the audience like they were all personal guests in his living room. Billed as Mr. Showmanship, he became one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world, filling concert halls, casinos, and TV screens with a mix of classical music, pop comedy, and pure camp. To many of his fans, especially older conservative audiences, he was the ultimate mama's boy showman, flashy, theatrical, but somehow still safe. That was the illusion he fought hard to keep in place. From very early in his career, speculation about his sexuality was everywhere. The costumes, the flirtatious manner, the way he decorated his sets and homes, it all screamed what no one was allowed to say. In an era when being publicly gay could end a career, Liberace's response was simple and aggressive: deny, deny, deny. When a British tabloid suggested he was homosexual in the 1950s, he sued for libel and won. Later, he took on Confidential magazine in the US over similar insinuations and settled. Each victory reinforced the official narrative Liberace was just an eccentric, deeply devoted to his mother bachelor who hadn't met the right woman yet. Behind the velvet curtains, the truth was very different. He had relationships with men, some brief, one very long and very complicated, his partnership with Scott Thorson, who later wrote a memoir about their life together. That book and the film Behind the Candelabra, based on it, pulled back the sequined curtain for good, revealing a world of lavish gifts, plastic surgery, emotional entanglement, and the power imbalance that comes with fame. Liberace never publicly acknowledged any of it while he was alive. Even as rumors swirled, he stuck to his line he was not gay, and anyone who said otherwise was lying. In 1987, Liberace died from complications related to AIDS, though for a time his camp insisted it was a different illness. Only after his death did the cause become widely known, completing the tragic circle of secrecy. The shock with Liberace isn't that he was gay, most people even then suspected as much. It's how fiercely he had to fight his own truth in public, even as his entire act practically winked at it. He turned the closet into a glittering palace, but it was still a closet, and the cost of keeping that door locked followed him all the way to the end. Sal Mineo. Sal Mineo is one of those names that makes the whole Golden Age closet story suddenly feel very real and very fragile. In Rebel Without a Cause, he played Plato, the lonely, intense kid whose devotion to James Dean's character is so raw it practically vibrates off the screen. Audiences in 1955 saw a troubled boy. Queer viewers, even if they couldn't say it out loud, saw something else. A kind of yearning that had almost never been shown that honestly in a studio film. Mineo was nominated for an Oscar for that role while still in his teens, then again a few years later for Exodus. He looked set to be one of Hollywood's defining young stars. But the system didn't know what to do with him. As he grew older, those sensitive boy roles dried up, and Hollywood's discomfort with his image only increased. Rumors about his orientation swirled, and he found himself stuck between who he was and what the industry wanted him to be. He worked in TV, on stage, in smaller films, but the golden boy momentum was gone. For an actor whose breakout role had been coded with queer longing, the irony was brutal. The very qualities that made Plato unforgettable became liabilities for the man who played him. In a town where leading men were expected to project uncomplicated heterosexual confidence, Mineo's intensity and perceived difference pushed him toward the margins. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Sal Mineo was living more openly in his personal life than many of his peers ever dared. He had relationships with men and moved in creative circles where that honesty was possible, at least in private. He was rebuilding his career on stage, earning strong reviews and showing just how much he'd grown as an actor. Then, in 1976, everything ended in a shockingly sudden, almost senseless burst of violence. Walking back to his apartment in Los Angeles after a rehearsal, he was stabbed in an apparent robbery and died at just 37. The news hit like a punch, the once bright teenager from Rebel Without a Cause gone in a dark parking lot far from the movie lights that had first found him. Today, Sal Mineo stands as a kind of tragic landmark in Hollywood's hidden queer history. He wasn't a polished, carefully protected closet case with a studio-built shield. He was a gifted, vulnerable man whose art and life both edged closer to the truth than his era was ready to embrace. His story is shocking not just because of the way it ended, but because you can see in that wide-eyed boy on screen and the complex man he became the outline of a career and a life that might have been so much bigger if he'd been allowed to be fully himself without fear. Clifton Webb. Clifton Webb was never the rough-and-tumble kind of leading man Hollywood usually adored. Thin, elegant, razor-tongued, and immaculately dressed, he specialized in characters who were precise, fussy, and devastatingly witty, from the poisonous Waldo Leidecker in Laura to the icy snob of The Razor's Edge and the all-knowing Mr. Belvedere. Audiences loved him for that sharp, slightly different energy, but few at the time could say out loud what critics and colleagues quietly understood: Webb was a queer star in an era that pretended such a thing didn't exist. He wasn't married, never courted starlets for the cameras, and radiated a kind of cultivated bachelorhood that felt like a secret everyone agreed not to name. Off-screen, his life was dominated by one relationship, his bond with his mother, Mabel. Webb lived with her for virtually his entire life, taking her everywhere: movie sets, dinner parties, premieres, vacations. When she died at 91, he was 71, and Noel Coward famously quipped, "It must be terrible to be orphaned at 71. It was a cruel joke with a grain of truth. Publicly, Mabel was his permanent date, the perfect shield in a world that would have recoiled at seeing him arrive on the arm of a man. Friends later recalled that she knew he was gay but maintained the family rule of never ever discussing it. She carried that silence with him, absorbing gossip, so he didn't have to answer questions directly. Within the industry, however, Webb's sexuality was an open secret. Directors, co-stars, and columnists alluded to it with winks and coded lines. One director even felt comfortable enough to ask him flat out if he was homosexual. He didn't flinch. He knew they knew, and they knew he knew. His queerness leaked out in jokes, in the campy glint of his performances, in the way writers tailored dialogue that played into his sissy image, while also sharpening it into something smarter and more dangerous. Instead of the limp, weak stereotype common at the time, Webb's characters were often the cleverest men in the room, acerbic, powerful, and socially lethal. Clifton Webb died in 1966, a few years after his mother, increasingly reclusive and in poor health. He left behind 3 Oscar nominations, a scholarship in his name, and a filmography full of characters that feel even now intriguingly queer-coded. What makes his story so compelling in the hidden history of Hollywood isn't some explosive scandal, but the way he turned survival into style. He walked a tightrope between being too effeminate for studio bosses and absolutely irresistible to audiences, crafting a persona that allowed him to be unmistakably himself without ever stating the one thing everyone already suspected. Noel Coward. Noel Coward was the man who turned being too clever by half into a full-time career. Playwright, songwriter, actor, director, raconteur, he practically was British show business between the wars. In plays like Private Lives, Designed for Living, and Blithe Spirit, he gave the world brittle, glamorous people trading perfect one-liners over cocktails, all while pretending nothing truly serious was happening underneath. But for anyone paying attention, the shine and the wit were also armor. Behind the tuxedo and the cigarette holder was a gay man operating in a world where one careless admission could shatter not just his reputation, but his freedom. Coward never married, never pretended to be a ladies' man, and rarely played along with studio-style romance narratives. Instead, he cultivated an image, the sophisticated, slightly untouchable bachelor, whose real love affair seemed to be with the theater itself. Within his inner circle, there was no great mystery. He had long-term relationships with men, and his friends knew exactly who he was. But publicly, he kept everything just this side of deniable. If a journalist strayed too close to personal questions, he had a ready supply of quips to knock them off balance. It wasn't exactly lying, it was fencing, and he was very, very good at it. You can see that double life woven straight into his writing. Design for Living put a scandalously modern triangle on stage with two men and a woman sharing love in a way that politely trampled traditional norms without ever spelling out everything in plain terms. His world was full of dapper men, strong-willed women, and relationships that didn't fit neat boxes, exactly the sorts of arrangements quietly happening in his own social circle. Censors and conservative critics sometimes complained that his plays were immoral or decadent, which in a sense was proof that he'd smuggled real-life complexity right into the respectable West End. As he grew older, Coward was eventually knighted and celebrated as a national treasure, but there was always a sense that he got there in spite of, not because of who he loved. He had served his country during the war, entertained troops, and brought in oceans of money for theaters and studios, yet still had to keep the most basic truths of his private life officially unspoken. That tension is what makes his story so striking in the context of closeted Hollywood and show business figures. Noel Coward didn't just survive by hiding. He built an entire glittering style around the art of saying everything and nothing at the same time, leaving behind work that still feels unmistakably queer in its bones, even though the man himself was never allowed to say the simple words out loud. Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde is one of those names that quietly rewrites how you see the Golden Age. For years, he was Britain's favorite matinee idol, dark, handsome, and charming in light comedies and war films, the kind of star mothers trusted and daughters swooned over. On paper, he was exactly what the rank organization wanted: safe, bankable, impeccably straight in every publicity shot. Yet behind that curated image was a man living a double life so carefully constructed that even his own best-selling memoirs never once named the truth everyone around him already knew. From the late 1940s onward, Bogarde shared his life with actor and manager Anthony Forwood. Officially, Forwood was the loyal assistant, the manager, the housemate. In reality, they built a home together in the English countryside, then in the south of France, and stayed partners for nearly 40 years until Forwood's death in 1988. Visitors understood the arrangement. The press, for the most part, pretended not to. Bogarde would occasionally be photographed with glamorous women to keep suspicions at bay, but he never married and never convincingly played the off-screen ladies' man the studio system preferred. The real turning point in his story came with Victim 1961. At a time when sex between men was still illegal in Britain, and most actors wouldn't touch queer themes, Bogarde agreed to play a barrister being blackmailed over his relationship with another man. It was the first British film to use the word homosexual directly, and he wasn't just reciting lines, he reportedly rewrote key scenes himself, including the moment his character admits his feelings to his wife. Taking that role meant risking his carefully guarded privacy, his career, and his financial security. He did it anyway, and the film went on to influence public debate in the years leading to the partial decriminalization of homosexuality in 1967. Even so, Bogarde never publicly came out. He spent his later years as a respected novelist and essayist, crafting elegant, evasive accounts of his life that left Anthony Forwood in the text, but stripped their relationship of any explicit label. Declassified Cold War files would later show that intelligence agencies quietly listed him as a practicing homosexual, not because he confessed, but because his secret was an open one in the right circles. Dirk Bogarde's story is shocking, not because he loved a man, but because he managed for decades to be both a closeted star and a subtle reformer, the heartthrob who helped crack the closet door on screen, even as he kept it firmly shut on himself. Forrest Tucker. Forrest Tucker is a good example of where we have to draw a clear line between rumor content and what's actually supported by evidence. On screen, he was the classic mid-century tough guy, about 6'5", broad-shouldered, and perfectly at home in westerns and war films. He appeared in nearly 100 movies and TV shows, from The Westerner and Chisholm to his most famous television role as Sergeant Morgan O'Rourke in F Troop. Publicity of the era framed him as a straightforward masculine presence, and his fan image fit the usual pattern: rugged, dependable, and uncontroversial as far as the mainstream record was concerned. When you look at the documented facts, we can verify Forrest Tucker's personal life actually reads as very conventional for a male star of his time. He married 4 times to Sandra Jolly, Marilyn Johnson, Marilyn Fisk, and Sheila Forbes, and had 3 children. Biographical references, studio materials, and contemporary obituaries all treat these marriages as genuine long-term relationships, not obvious beards hastily arranged by panicked publicists. That doesn't automatically prove anything about his private feelings, of course, but it does mean there's a clear paper trail for his straight public life and no comparable, credible trail for same-sex relationships the way there is for someone like Rock Hudson or Tab Hunter. Online, you'll sometimes see Forrest Tucker's name floated in the same breath as old Hollywood secrets or hidden gay stars, especially in clicky YouTube videos or low-quality blogs. But when you dig into those pieces, they almost never point to primary documents, serious biographies, or first-hand testimony. They just chain together rumors and generic closet narratives. In contrast, standard film histories and reference works about Tucker do not describe him as gay, bi, or involved in any documented queer scandal. Given your rule to say no to fake news, slotting him in as a gay closet case would be pure speculation rather than responsible storytelling. So if you're building a script or article around 50 gay closet cases in the golden age of Hollywood that will shock you, Forrest Tucker is one of the names you should probably leave out, or if you mention him at all, it should be to debunk the rumor, not amplify it. There's nothing wrong with examining queer subtext or questioning studio PR myths, but once we step past what solid evidence supports, we're just turning a real person's life into clickbait. For Tucker, the honest position right now is rugged character actor, prolific career, plenty of ups and downs, but no reliable evidence that he belongs on a confirmed LGBTQ closet case list. Rupert Everett. Rupert Everett is one of the rare names in this whole closet conversation who actually did what so many golden age actors could only dream of. He came out publicly while still in the game. Born in 1959, he broke through in the early 1980s with Another Country, playing a gay schoolboy at an English public school, a role that immediately tied his image to queer themes even before he said anything about himself. Tall, aristocratic, and slightly aloof, he was built to be a romantic leading man, and at first it looked like that's exactly where his career was heading. In 1989, he moved to Paris, wrote a novel, and came out as gay. By his own account, that decision changed everything. He said more than once that coming out hurt his career, that scripts and offers from Hollywood dried up, and that he was quietly reclassified not as a versatile actor who happened to be gay, but as a gay actor, full stop. The industry still wanted a very specific kind of safely straight leading man, and Rupert no longer fit the template. For a while, he drifted on the margins, interesting parts in European films, stage work, writing, and voice roles, but nothing like the A-list trajectory many assumed he'd have after his early success. Then came My Best Friend's Wedding in 1997, and everything flipped again. As George Julia Roberts' sharp, charming, gay best friend Everett stole the film so completely that he all but redefined the GBF trope for mainstream audiences. He followed it with An Ideal Husband, The Next Best Thing, and an unforgettable turn as Prince Charming in the Shrek sequels, becoming one of the few openly gay actors Hollywood allowed to be both visible and bankable so long as he stayed in the sidekick or supporting lane. He's been candid, sometimes brutally so, about how frustrating it was to watch straight actors win awards for playing gay roles while he, an out gay man, found leading parts increasingly hard to get. In later years, Everett has reinvented himself yet again as a writer, director, and commentator. His memoirs blend acid wit with painful honesty about drugs, difficult relationships, financial struggles, and the cost of being the gay one in a still cautious industry. He eventually wrote, directed, and starred in The Happy Prince about Oscar Wilde's final days, another queer artist broken by a world that wouldn't accept him. Rupert Everett's story isn't a simple closet tale. It's almost the sequel to all those golden age tragedies. He stepped out into the light, survived, made unforgettable work, and has spent decades telling anyone who will listen just how high the price of that honesty can still be. And so we end this journey through closets, contracts, and carefully constructed lies, not to out the dead, but to question the systems that forced them to hide in the first place. Some of these legends left evidence, some left only rumors, and others may have been straight people swallowed by gossip. What we know for sure is that Hollywood has never been honest about desire, identity, or power. The real question now is yours: who deserves to be named, who deserves to be protected, and who gets to decide? Tell me in the comments. This